Afro-American militancy. This series is predicated on the belief that the situation facing the Negro in the ghetto today is very similar to what has confronted him since World War I, the time when most of the present urban ghettos were formed. With the problems having been similar for the past 40 years, it can be assumed that many of the radical programs of the past had similarities to the possible programs of today and tomorrow. Questions to be answered here are, what have been the strong and weak points of past black nationalism? And what difficulties have there been in cooperation between blacks and whites of the left? And how did the previous generation deal with issues of integration and separation? There are many ways to handle such questions. Here they will be dealt with biographically. It is hoped that an exposition of the lives of individual militants will provide a type of understanding of black radicalism which will transcend the constitution and bylaws of various movements and provide instead a picture of how individuals related to their political groups. Using the personal approach leads to the discovery that black nationalists and integrationists have been far more interconnected than one would ever imagine from reading official pronouncements. It seems that the more a nationalist or integrationist opted for radical solutions, the more they had in common and the less has been their division. The wiping away of the division line can be seen today in the nationalistic turn of SNCC, which is becoming more nationalistic while it becomes more radical in opposing American imperialism abroad. As the late Al-Malak Shabazz Malcolm X became increasingly revolutionary, he was driven to seek cooperation with certain radical whites and even to say a kind word for the area of struggle carried on by Martin Luther King. Nationalists who dabble in integration and integrationists who dabble in nationalistic programs are a common recurrence in past black radicalism. This series emphasizes the individual radical, and a few introductory words are in order to describe the major movements of past radicalism. It must be kept in mind that it is radical movements which are here treated, not liberal ones. The NAACP and Urban League are now establishment history. World War I saw 250,000 blacks come north to seek employment in defense industries, and many thousands more go abroad to save the world for democracy. The black troops saw a non-racist France and returned after the war determined to make America safe for democracy. The tension of returning troops and the anger of black people who had come north seeking freedom only to find a somewhat more subtle or more subtle racism led to a fervent militancy in 1919. The single most important outgrowth of this militancy was the Universal Negro Improvement Association of Marcus Garvey. This nationalistic back-to-Africa crusade had anywhere from a few 100,000 to a few million members at its height in the early post-World War I years. General histories treat Garveyites as if they were a horde of uneducated enthusiasts enraptured by nationalistic demagogy given out by the eloquent Garvey. A study of individual lives of leading Garveyites, however, and Garvey supporters, shows a degree of educational and practical sophistication quite normal for a movement drawing from the masses. And overall, for a decade, Garveyites were the dominant group in the American political scene, and all other radical groups existed in either positive or negative relation to the UNIA. Political is here used in its broad sense, not just in terms of political parties. The Garveyite program proposed an international citizenship of color, whereby any Negro anywhere was to become a citizen of a powerful home nation in Africa, and a percentage of American Negroes were to migrate to Africa to help legitimize the ties between the continents. Once the plan was in operation, American Negroes could leave whites to run this country, but if any Georgia redneck cracker laid a hand on a Georgia Negro, that Negro could complain to his ambassador in Washington that he, a citizen of a foreign country, had been manhandled by this American racist. So ran the theory. The less academic appeal of Garvey was that he provided a psychological escape from America, and through his many community centers, social services, and cooperative businesses, the follower of the UNIA got to feel a part of a separate world within a world. Around the Garveyites were many splinter groups and small and vocal contingents of black socialists, most of whom had at one time or another worked with Garvey. There was the African Blood Brotherhood, a Marxist group which considered Garvey too conservative and called for revolution in both America and Africa. The Brotherhood envisioned a worldwide federation of radical Negroes which would work clandestinely to sweep aside colonialism. It sought to establish ties in the African hinterland with comparatively unreached Africans who would be made a revolutionary vanguard for sweeping down upon the colonialist plantations. Centered in Harlem, the Brotherhood had branches in a number of American cities and in some islands of the Caribbean. A. Philip Randolph, who in 1919 had shared the speaking platform with Garvey, came to lead the integrationist left in a war on the Garveyites in the UNIA. The integrationist force was a coalition of socialist and NAACP liberals. In 1925, Randolph himself would be labeled a nationalist. Many liberals felt his organizing of the black-only Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters was a sign of negative reverse segregation. In the early 30s, the beginning of the Great Depression, there was brought alive a radicalism which had been waning during the late 20s. One of the more popular movements would be known, or should be known, to all SNCC and CORE sit-inners. Unfortunately, it has been ignored in histories. This was the spontaneous, grassroots-based movement for jobs in ghettos, stores, and industries known as the Don't Buy Where You Can't Work campaigns. Virtually every northern city had a campaign of its own. The tactics were the boycott, the picket line, and physical intimidation. These campaigns lacked national direction, were the expression of long simmering frustration in the ghetto, and they were thoroughly nationalistic. In very few cities were there any white participants. The white leftists in general saw these activities as divisive of the labor movement. The jobs campaigns brought about a confusion in the minds of the leftists who wished to help the Negro, but yet could not see the peculiar problems of Negroes in the ghetto during the Depression, most significantly the fact that despite all the unemployment, Negroes remained twice the percentage on relief and on the dole of unemployed and suffering in general from the Depression. Aside from the jobs campaigns, the early 30s was the heyday of Communist Party involvement in Negro life. While many an ex-Garveyite was running off to Father Divine or Daddy Grace, another large percentage was joining the Communists. And the Communists were proud of having stolen the nationalist program and membership. Indeed, the Communists had a thoroughly nationalistic program during the Depression years. They proposed a Negro Republic to be created in the Black Belt of the South and run by a resident black majority. While winning over nationalists, the Communists also led battles against slumlords with their anti-eviction militia and fought for relief payments through workers' councils. On the Black Belt Republic, it is noteworthy that the design of the plan was largely the work of a former member of the African Blood Brotherhood who joined the Communists in 1925 and was in Moscow in 1928 at the meeting of the Red International and there successfully argued the point of a separate republic. Harry Haywood, this longtime communist theorist, still around, no longer with the party, but he is active today in black power circles. So go the connections here between nationalistic programs and integrationist or leftist programs. The broad class consciousness of the New Deal era swept aside nationalism, and black radicals came overwhelmingly to commit themselves to solving racism by exposing its economic foundation in capitalism. The efforts of CIO unionists to conscientiously fight for integration made nationalism seem irrelevant. Still, there was the phenomena of the March on Washington movement of 1941. The CIO was fine, but other unions and industry itself segregated. To combat the racism of both labor and management, thousands of Negroes gathered in Chicago and in New York to threaten a march on Washington of 100,000 black peoples unless the growing defense armaments industries were open to Negro workers. Now, to summarize this little introduction, certainly more needs to be done in the way of background of the movements, and there will be 2 installments in this series specifically on the Garvey movement, but for the most part, the background will have to be worked in with the biographies. And today's biography, Grover Cleveland Redding. It turned out to be a nice Sunday for the parade. Grover Cleveland Redding led the small procession through the streets of Chicago's South Side. He rode a white stallion to enhance the regal appearance of his multicolored toga. Behind him came followers of the Star Order of Ethiopia and Ethiopian missionaries to Abyssinia, otherwise known as the Abyssinians. The parade ended in front of a cafe on East 35th Street, and after a brief ceremony, Redding produced an American flag, poured gasoline over it, and set it afire. He and an associate each took a corner, and they walked up and down the street with the blazing Old Glory flapping in the wind. Getting somewhat carried away, Redding produced a pistol and put a few bullet holes in the charred remains. 2 white policemen tried to restrain the men, but were intimidated with threats and the brandishing of revolvers. They left to seek reinforcements from the station house, but a Negro policeman remained, and when Redding started to ignite a second flag, he tried to take it away from him, only to be shot and wounded. A white sailor also protested the destruction of the flag and was also shot. One of the Abyssinians shouted to the onlookers, "Join us, brothers. We are 40 million strong." A number of high-powered rifles were then obtained from a limousine that had accompanied the parade. Police arrived, there was further shooting, and all told 2 were killed and half dozen wounded. For the moment, the Abyssinians got away. Many believed Redding to be insane, and if he was, it was the insanity of the overly logical mind. If logic dictated a revolutionary solution for Negroes, then there should be guns and shooting. There was, and Redding was eventually hanged for murder. The flag-burning incident took place on June 20th, 1920, and was the most extreme expression of post-World War I black radicalism. The Abyssinians were formed in the spring of 1919 as a militant offshoot of the Garveyites. Whereas the Garvey movement asked for money for ships to return to Africa, Redding sought funds for an armed train to ride into Dixie and begin the revolution. In place of the Garveyite return to Africa, Redding proposed black Americans take out citizenship immediately under the Ethiopian flag. His organization raised funds by selling Abyssinian flags and certificates of citizenship. Redding told his followers that he was a native of Ethiopia, but in fact he was born in Georgia. In his home state, the Reddings were known as a family that had difficulty relating properly to the realities of life, i.e., they didn't take well or acquiesce to American racism. Some members of the Klan had been put in the Mildredville, Georgia insane asylum at the time of Grover's hanging in June of 1921. He had come north sometime prior to World War I. His political activities began through friendship developed with a radical white family which shared the same apartment house. Redding was out of work and would drop in to get a free meal now and then, and the missus of the house suggested to her husband that their neighbor seemed a bright young fellow and a fitting aid for the community work engaged in by her husband. This white man, the bearded Dr. J.D. Jonas, was a freelance militant of sorts who worked in Negro ghettos, agitating at street corners and attempting to organize poor Negroes around a variety of economic schemes. For a while, he ran a cooperative store in the Chicago ghetto and tried to sell shares to his customers. In 1917, he was active in raising supplies of food and clothing for relief of black victims of the East St. Louis race riot. The toga worn by Redding at the flag burning had originally belonged to Jonas. It was Jonas who formed the Abyssinian order, but it was Redding who became its leader. The black man was far more effective in street corner organizing than was the white. Also, the order drew much of its membership from dissidents of the Garveyites. These newcomers looked on Jonas as somewhat out of place in a black organization. Redding stole Jonas' thunder and finally was given the toga, other regalia, and the leadership. There was an attempt to form branches outside of Chicago, but other cities seemed far less interested in Redding's brand of militancy. In the hotbed of Chicago, he could sell the Abyssinian flags for $1 apiece, but in Detroit he found they went for only 8 to 15 cents. It seems some headway was made, since applications for membership contained mailing addresses in Washington, D.C. and New York. The actual size of the movement was bound to secrecy, as was the planned armed train, a scheme which only became known during Redding's trial for murder. After the flag burning and shooting, Redding and 7 of his followers, including 2 women, barricaded themselves inside a hideaway. However, a tip-off to the police led to their quick arrest. Redding and Oscar McGavick were tried for murder. The latter man was secretary of the proposed armed train. Redding's disdain for American society shown in the flag burning was carried over into his trial. He pleaded guilty to murder and refused to sit politely during the proceedings, throwing books at prosecution witnesses and calling them names. He took the witness stand for an opportunity to defend his movement and its objectives. Upon hearing the verdict, he stood up and said, "I do not want a new trial, Judge. If they are going to hang me, let them do it now so the worry will be over." Redding was the recipient of much money during his imprisonment, but he tore it into tiny shreds and cast it about his cell. It was not that he actually wanted to die. When the governor of Illinois issued a 2-month stay of execution for him and McGavick, there was wild rejoicing and the singing of songs on death row. But whether they hanged him or didn't hang him, Redding was going to stick to his ways until the end. While in confinement, he refused to answer to anyone who did not call him by the title King Sheba from the Clouds. The Chicago Defender reported that at his execution, he walked to his death with a firm tread. His 37 years of life may have ended in failure. Nonetheless, for one summer day in 1920, he had experienced a liberation from America, which was probably a flight into insanity, but if so, an insanity hidden in the hearts of many a black American.